welcome to all of you, those whom I know and those whom I don't know. Wonderful to be brought together. I want to thank Sarah Audsley and Allison Marlin for their help in choreographing this event, and to say that we are going to have sort of three separate parts to this hour and 15 minutes, and there will be breakouts toward the end of the first two parts, and then a general whole group Q&A at the end. So this is one of four sessions in an attempt to sort of publicize the different parts of my new and final book, Numbskull in the Theater of Inquiry, an understandable title, and then a more understandable subtitle, Transforming Self, Friends, Organizations, and Social Science. And the book is a fairly complex one in the sense that it has lots of different voices, first-person voice in terms of my own memoirs, which make up sort of the center of the book, but then sort of more theoretical endnotes after each chapter that people can look at, and a series of appendices. How many of you have actually got the book at this point? You want to put a thumbs up if you, or a hand up? Okay, it looks like from what little I can see, about half maybe. I want to, of course, the whole point of this is also a crassly marketing orientation. I am very hopeful that a number of you will see fit to spread the word to your own groups of affiliates, because I have no real way of bringing this book to light other than by word of mouth. And so I'll be very grateful for any help you provide in that regard. So let's turn to the first moment of this meeting. And as many of you know, we almost always open our meetings with a 3-minute meditation, you might call it. We call listening into the dark. And usually I make no comments during that meditation. I let everybody listen into the dark, whatever the heck that means. The dark is something you see or don't see, and why is it listening rather than looking? But anyway, that title is meant to make it mysterious and to give you a little help in asking yourself, what am I listening into here in this meditation? So I'll make a few comments as we go along in this. So if you want to take whatever your relaxed, back, free, and vertical posture, and it's usually helpful to let your eyes close at first in order to let other senses take over from our dominant seeing sense. And I'd suggest that you first give yourself a chance to listen into what is going on in the outside world in terms of the other senses. What are you touching? What are you hearing in the outside world? And as I quiet down a little bit with this intentional attention, I can begin coming into my bodily sensations, inner sensations, the breath as it enters and leaves and continues to do so. It will always be entering and leaving when I attend to it. And I can move through from the top of my head all the way down to my toes, slowly becoming aware of the sensation at each level of my body. And I may be able to sort of settle into the point behind the hara from which I can feel it all going on at once. And with this concentration on my inner sensation, it's easier to kind of catch the flitting thoughts going on in my mind. Partly simply a recognition of what you're hearing me say, but all kinds of things may be jumping around in there. And if I can include all three of these territories, the sensations of the outside world, the inner sensation, the thought, and perhaps I begin to realize that there's a fourth quality that is attending to all of that, a post-cognitive awareness or consciousness. That's different from a mental awareness. And the claim in action inquiry and developmental theory is that I can more and more become aware of all four territories at once. And that's extremely useful in being able to really attend to what's going on at any given moment in the world I'm engaged with. So we could allow our eyes to open again. And I'd like to make a little comment about these four territories of experience, which any of you who have met with me before know is a central theme in all my writing and thought, because I don't think I've ever managed to express quite how significant this notion is. That first of all, you might call it a theory of four territories of experience, but of course the point is to make it an experience of the four territories. The question is, does the theory identify real experiences? I thought of a new way of saying this very briefly, and that is that we have several different ontologies in the West. The most dominant ontology in the last several centuries has been that the main and indeed only reality is the outside world, right? This is called realism. The arguments by brain scientists are that the brain is real and consciousness is a sort of a throw-off artifact of the brain. More spiritual people will sometimes assert, yes, the world is one, there's only one reality, but it's consciousness. And it's consciousness that forms our experience of the world. And we're really not aware of the outside world, we're aware of our experience of the outside world. So there's these two different types of monism that most people believe one or the other is the case. And then there's the notion of dualism, which has also been prominent in philosophy, that both are true. They are two different things, outside world, inner consciousness, and never the twain shall meet. We don't know how they relate to each other. And of course, most of us don't really know how they relate to each other. One attitude is we'll never know. It's by the nature of the universe, it's impossible to know. But more recently, scientists, mystics, people who combine the two, talk about the notion of dual aspect monism. That is that there's actually an underlying single reality, and both mind and the empirical world are part of that. So that's kind of the most sophisticated notion of all of reality. But I want to argue that we are capable of fourfold awareness, these four territories, and that we don't know how they're related to one another to begin with. And when we begin to learn about it, we frequently do so by discovering incongruities among the levels. We want to act lovingly, but we hear ourselves shouting. And we realize there's a discordance between our value or idea or ideal, our intent, and our actual impact or practice. So we begin learning what connects all four by this kind of study of all four at once in our action. So I offer that in the hope that it may clarify something a little bit for you. And I want to now take a 6-minute breakout period in trios. And I suggest that you try continuing the exercise of being aware of the four territories as you speak with one another about your experience of the meditation we did and of this little conceptual introduction and indeed of how it's going while you're in this trio. So Sarah, as soon as you're ready, throw them into trios. Good to see you're still here. I'd love to just take a minute or two at most to ask if any of you, have a particular question based on the process we've just been through, or a comment that may be based on something you heard from somebody else in your little trio that you think might be valuable for others. So we're just going to give a minute or two for this. Please just come on in, anybody who's ready. Unmute yourself and come in.
Bill? Hi, it's Kathy here.
Hi, Kathy.
I just... Oops. Hello. Hi, sorry about that. A call just came in because I'm on my phone. I was just, you mentioned before you were talking about the different ontologies, and you mentioned realism and dualism, and then you mentioned the dual aspect. I didn't quite get what you said, and it piqued my curiosity very much.
Yes, dual aspect monism.
Okay.
One person who talks about this is Jeffrey Kripal, Kripal, who is a marvelous writer, has fascinating books. And I don't know that in his books yet, at least I haven't seen his most recent, but I heard him with Terry Patton. I don't know if Terry Patton is a name any of you know, Patten, who has done interviews with various people, and Jeff was one of them. So they talk about dual aspect monism, meaning that there is some kind of connection between consciousness and the material world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bill, we've got a question in the chat, actually a great question, about could you add some colour and context of further explanation of your four territories? So struggling a bit getting arms around how that looks in real time or real life? Do you have a way of framing it that could help the group?
Right. Let's see if the third thing we do together doesn't start to respond to that question, and please bring it up again then, okay? I think this will relate to the, I'll give an example that may be an example of that. Now, we sent out a reading from Aftab Irfan that's in the book. Do people want to put up their hands if they actually were able to get to that reading? Almost no one. Okay, I'm going to read it. That was the question, was whether I would read it. So in addition to my memoir, we have 3 stories in the book that are in effect brief memoir moments of Aftab Irfan, who is the Director of Equity for the city of Vancouver. And she is a beautiful writer and I think gives striking demonstrations. So I'm going to read this and invite you to think about what this means in developmental terms. Is there a developmental interpretation of this story she tells? And then we'll give you a chance to talk about it among yourselves, and also to share any stories of your own that come to mind that you begin to realize are developmentally meaningful stories. So here's hers. When I was 18 and a first-year university student, I tried to starve myself. Instead of putting on the famous freshman 15, I lost at least that much. If I had seen a doctor, I would have undoubtedly been diagnosed with an anorexia, the most common psychiatric disorder for a woman in my age group at the time. People often think that anorexia is about body image and the desire to get skinny or the fear of being fat. This definitely played a part in what I was going through in 1999, in the sense that I felt proud to be buying a size 2 dress and looking more like the models on billboards than I will at any other time in my life. But my decision to stop feeding myself was far more complicated than that. It wasn't so much that I was fighting my weight, it was more that I was fighting food itself and the basic biological idea of the necessity of food. Every night at 7 p.m., I would watch my roommate and the girls in my dormitory go down to the cafeteria for supper, just before the cafeteria closed down at 7:30. I would think about joining them, and then I would procrastinate. I would putter around and distract myself in my room until it was too late to join them. Once 7:30 hit, I had no possibility of eating, so there was no danger of my hunger winning over my decision to not eat. I would feel a strange feeling of triumph every night as I did this. I would feel triumphant again in the morning when I would wake up and still be alive. It was as if I was saying to my body, "Ha ha, look, I didn't eat and I didn't need to. You said I'd be dead, but I survived again." Food, which I had grown up being taught was very important, was turning out to be not totally vital after all. But why did I get into this game with myself? I wonder now, looking back at that time. The reasons seem clear. That was a tough year. I was homesick, having left my parents' house for the first time. I was lost in the large sea that was the University of British Columbia, a place that didn't care about me and to which I felt no sense of belonging. We had immigrated to Canada 3 years prior, and I had barely managed to make myself an identity as an academic superstar in high school. I had been mildly bullied in my mostly white high school, but I had survived through superstardom. Now I was among thousands of new university students from all over the world. For the first time, the social or academic ladder I was supposed to climb was not so apparent. I was disoriented, and I didn't know who I wanted to be. I had also just lost a best friend, first love romance, And even though I was pretending I didn't care, I was devastated by the loss. Somehow, what I put into my mouth felt like the only thing I could actually control in a world that was completely outside of my control. Denying myself food was a way of exercising my willpower and feeling dominance over my own body. It was enjoyable in a way. Anorexia was to actual starvation as cutting is to suicide. It was a taste, a flirtation with death, a chosen infliction of pain at one's own hands. It made me feel involved in my own destiny. It did wonders for me at the time. I grew out of it eventually as I felt more at home in my new surroundings. But something unexpected happened in this anorexic exercise too, which had more lasting effects. While it would never have occurred to me at the time, I now wonder if my wrestling with my appetite was actually a symbolic way of wrestling with my ambition. When I stopped eating and found that I could still stay alive, I also realized that I could stop feeding my achievement-oriented tendencies, and that wouldn't kill me either. If food wasn't totally essential, maybe money, career, a social circle, a husband, and all the other supposed accomplishments weren't so essential either. I had come into university as an ambitious overachiever, a young girl who was going to conquer the world of science. I would, of course, not go into the social sciences or humanities because they didn't have as much status. And I was in a science honors program with a bunch of ambitious, overachieving kids, most of whom wanted to be doctors and astronauts. As I willed myself to lose my appetite for food that year, I also willed myself to curb my ambitions. Being a doctor or an astronaut would have been amazing, something to write home about for sure, but it seemed kind of meaningless to me, as did the social life on campus centered around drinking and sex. It suddenly didn't seem necessary to work towards a high station in society, an important position that would sustain me and nourish me. I realized I needed and wanted very little of that. So when it came to the end of the spring semester and I had to choose my major, I chose the one scientific field that seemed to me to be directly about humans, the very unprestigious Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences. Around the same time, I started dating my first real boyfriend, a young redhead, too shy to ask me out in person, so he wrote a love letter, the very understated mad genius in my class, who set up a private fireworks show on the beach for my 19th birthday. I can't say that I have ever looked back. So part of what I'm advocating is that a form of first-person research that can be really revelatory is to write autobiographically about our own background and not thinking of it in theoretical terms at all to begin with, but then on a second pass, asking the question, do these experiences have anything like a developmental sequence? And does thinking about where the transitions between one action logic and another, where they may have been occurring in my life, does that throw greater light on what happened then? And in some cases, even assuage suffering that we may feel, because I've discovered that it's in our transitions between action logics that we have the least control over ourselves in a sense, and we're in our most exploratory mode, and we're more likely to make kind of epic mistakes, or in my case, numbskullian actions. I didn't start out Numbskull in the theater of inquiry with that title in mind, I can assure you, but it gradually grew on me as I saw in how many different ways I managed to take unnecessary and grandiose sorts of risks that sometimes went awry. It was also true that taking those big risks sometimes led to big wins. And I guess because of that, I kept on being that way. And now I'm so much that way, I can't stop. So even though Numbskull isn't one of the developmental categories, we can gradually come up with our own very own unique categories that are meaningful to us. So what I'm interested in doing now is inviting you to take a longer breakout, and not only you might start it by saying, what may be the developmental analysis of this moment in Aftab's life? What sort of transition was she navigating in a developmental sense? But then if you find some stories of your own from listening to her story and from talking together, you might share a little story of your own. So once again, let's throw them into groups. Welcome back, everyone. Again, let me just check and see if there may be some question or comment that is on the top of your mind before we go on to our final little activity.
Bill, a question that came up for us was this: does there have to be some kind of traumatic event or something that in essence causes and or forces or conjures up a need to transition, say from one action logic to another, or go through a developmental stage change? Can it just be sort of gradual and sort of almost smooth and transitional, or does it have to be something that causes and disrupts one's life?
No, I don't think it has to be something that's easily denotable. One of the important things that helped me move from expert to achiever was playing on a soccer team with an incredible coach who led us to an undefeated season by showing us that we shouldn't just play our own positions, but we should move fluidly around the field and not just immediately return to our own positions. This drove the opposition frantic because they didn't know who to guard. This was just one of the ways in which and by having an undefeated season, I realized, wow, there's such power in a group. It's not just me, it's not just my technical proficiency. So that there certainly are examples like that where the development, where there's a developmental space that turns out to support the move from one action logic to another and makes it a non-traumatic process. Well, now, Bob, you also asked the question, I think, about giving some color about these four territories and how we use it in everyday life. I think the piece I was going to read last of all from the book for today speaks to that. And so let's see if it does, and we can respond to your question more specifically after I read it. So this is a story about a time when I was 26 and I had just started at Southern Methodist University as a faculty member, and I had been allotted this new course that they had invented, which was perfect for Dallas, Texas, which was to transform our undergraduates from budding bureaucrats to budding entrepreneurs. How did you teach somebody? What kind of rules could you offer for people making their own rules? I mean, it had that wonderful paradoxical quality to it. And they added to that by making it a course that ran between 250 and 420 people each semester. of the 4 semesters that I was there. So it was a completely unmanageable course in a traditional sense. I mean, you would normally, I guess, for a 400-person course, have lectured the whole time, which would obviously do nothing to train people to be entrepreneurs other than to give them some new words. So we created a course that was full of choices for students and actions that they needed to take and feedback that they would be getting on their actions, and teams that they had to join, and evaluations by the team of each of their individuals, as well as evaluations by the faculty of work that the students did. And we had a set of consultants from, at least not the first term, but the last 3 terms. We found that the very best students in the class were very interested in working at it again from a consultant point of view and consulting to these groups. So those people were getting an more intensive training in thinking and acting for themselves, but on behalf of a larger group. And we were in the second term, coming to the end of the semester, and it had been quite successful. So had the first term. But on the third night before the end, we had a session that was all devoted to students self-evaluating themselves, but listening to other people's feedback, and also the group evaluating itself. This was all going to count on the grade. It was a percentage of the final grade, a fairly significant percentage. And this is where I'll read. The team evaluations and the self-evaluations, which counted significantly in the final grade, were occurring that evening. As the session proceeded, I began to hear more and more stories from students, teaching assistants, and other faculty of rigged, superficial, or otherwise invalid evaluations by groups. I began to feel that our objective of creating a structure that guided students toward responsible adult goal setting, action, and evaluation, weaning them from dependence on the predefined structure, had made no impact whatsoever, despite the repeated assertions by many of the students themselves that it had. I remember sitting in my small office as I heard these reports, feeling glared at by the overhead light, and feeling as though I were inside a nightmare, the victim of forces greater than whatever paltry allies I might have. The course was virtually over. We had no more leverage. One of our primary systems intended to engender reflection and self-correction was itself being subverted. In this moment, perhaps just to get away from the glare, I closed my eyes, put my head down on my arms, and tried, much against my depressive inclination, to sit with myself quietly, prayerfully, if you will. Breath and pulse entered my awareness, as well as thoughts and feelings. I already had some 4 territory training from the spiritual path called the Gurdjieff work. But I, rarely remembered to try at that time to become aware of the 4 territories at once. So here I was. I allowed it all without focusing on any of it, feeling a gradual diminution of the nightmarishness and a rising gratefulness to the source of this blooming attention. And here I quote from Pascal. I was re-entering the present. We never keep to the present, Pascal tells us. We recall the past. We anticipate the future. This is Pascal speaking. We are so vain that we dream of times that are not and blindly flee the only one that is. Thus, we never actually live, but hope to live. And since we are always planning to be happy, it is inevitable that we should never be so. I find that just an incredibly powerful reminder. I began to remember some of the principles that had emerged over the past 9 months. One was to take whatever appeared to be a block or barrier to progress and redefine it as a building block. Another lesson was, when in a jam, think of the last thing I would ordinarily do and try it out. When I tried that the first time, it had luckily worked. So, but obviously the idea is to stop taking your ordinary thought process for being the right one, and realizing that you may be beyond your competence here, and you need to invent something that you wouldn't ordinarily consider. Instead of giving up, as I may too easily have done on other occasions, I decided to fight. With this decision, the calmness that had supplanted the nightmare began to turn into anger. And the anger began to turn into an unusually intemperate message to the students, which describes more particularly what was making me now so angry. Even before the end of the class, most of the message was written. After review by the staff, it was amended, duplicated, and handed to the students the following week on career night, along with the sparse announcement that all evaluation decisions reached between groups and staff members the previous week were null and void, to be renegotiated after discussion of this message on the final night 1 week hence. So it goes on, but in fact, this worked. And the final night, the consultants of the groups and the groups themselves were evidently, I didn't know whether it was going to work or not, but were evidently ready to do something. One of the examples I gave of cheating was of a football team player who was quite a hero on campus, who also told his group at the beginning that he was a born-again Christian. And although he had appeared somewhat distant and insensitive, this story made the other people in the group like him. But within a week or two, he stopped participating in the group. And at that evaluation process that occurred at the third week before the end, he and two other guys had ranked themselves at the top of the group in terms of participation and contribution, and had rated the three people who were in fact the most participatory and leadershiply at the bottom, in an effort to swing the evaluation so they would be closer to the average. This, of course, was discovered instantly when the consultant took a look and was very well aware of who had and had not participated. So he actually came up to me after the beginning of the last session and said, I realize I'm going to get beaten up in this next session, and that I've got to accept it. And indeed, he did get beaten up, and indeed, he did accept it. So, this is a sort of example of having reached the point in my own inner work where I was able to use it in a social situation that really needed it, and to try to reconnect the purpose of the course to the practice of the course and the outcomes, and that did seem to work. So now let me check, Bob, whether that speaks to the question that you raised. Oh, you need to unmute.
Yeah, if I can just check my understanding, as you sort of sense the real experience of the groups and the self-assessment and how that was information was being discerned and coming back to you, and you were reflecting a little bit on your own concern about the fact that it was false information, so to speak. Putting your head down on the table was sort of your entering into maybe the third territory and ultimately the fourth territory of some new realization of what you in some way had to do to kind of come to grips with where you saw this reality and what to do about it? Am I getting that? Or
yes, very much so. I mean, like, this was the contrary to the intent of the course, and the structure was not the structure we had created to realize the intent of the course was not working. And I think so. It was a defeat of what was a sort of structure that we on the staff were all quite proud of. And at first, I just couldn't see any alternative. I could only see defeat. And I think that putting my head on the desk, I mean, first of all, was a kind of admission of defeat. I just have to let go of all my hopes and sense of what to do. And then, I think it made it easier for me to sort of really feel my feelings more directly rather than just be affected by them in that position. And it permitted me to imagine that we still did have a chance. At first I had thought, well, we only have 2 more weeks, and they're all very well planned, just like everything else in the course. And so we don't have time to do anything about it. But then I realized that there was no reason why the last session had to be a celebration of the term. In this case, it ought to be a correction of the term, which would, in a way, be a better celebration than a celebration. It would be a realization of what we had hoped for.
And had you not put your head on the table, so to speak, and it's possible you would have just accepted things as they were, and then the opportunity for change, not only for yourself, but for everybody else in the course, the football player, et cetera, wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, right. Or, maybe who knows, maybe after the session, other faculty members would have been creative in this way. So maybe it would have been saved by somebody else. It's hard to imagine in retrospect. It's working differently than it did, since in the end it worked out well, although in the middle it did not. Others of you who want to raise any questions or observations about either of the stories?
So, Bill, you said in your mid-20s when that happened?
Yes.
So you experienced it as a personal defeat. You used that term, defeat. Someone else might have just looked at it as, even at that young age, as process didn't work, let's find something else. So why was it experienced as a personal defeat?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is that I had already run a program, the Yale Upward Bound program at Yale, for Black and white students from backgrounds of poverty at the age of 22, which was totally ridiculous. And although we had had some successes in the Upward Bound program, we also had some significant defeats or lack of success. And the program at the end of the second summer, which was when Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated, and there was a tremendous rift from the Black and white, between the Black and white community all over the country. But that second summer was full of semi-violence in the program, and I felt like I had failed as a leader in the end. I had succeeded the first summer in various ways, but then failed under the greater strain of the second summer. And so when I went to SMU, I was completely blunt with myself that however good what we set up might be for students' development, that could not be the first criterion. The first criterion had to be a kind of success that the students themselves and the faculty recognized, that I had gone too far in the direction of innovative work, which I had no idea how to control. And so whatever our innovations were at SMU, they had to result, in my opinion, in something that the students regarded as success. And in fact, it turned out, I mean, we did an enormous amount of research on the process, and the students did respond positively in the end to every one of the 4 semesters, each of which was structured differently. After each one, we thought we'd learned something new about it. So that I think is why I was being tough on myself at that moment. Well, look, folks, we've reached the last minute. Thank you so much. I hope that it was useful going back and forth like this. And I hope to see some of you again. Next time, we'll be focusing on second-person research rather than first-person research. So I hope to see some or most of you then. In the meantime, take care.